Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello there and welcome. Before there was a Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto, and before the International Ice Hockey Federation Hall of Fame was established in Zurich, Switzerland, there was and is the original Hockey Hall of Fame right here in Kingston, Ontario. Many volunteers have devoted countless hours to gathering artifacts, doing research to tell the story of the game, and the players that made the game what it is today. It all started with Captain James T. Sutherland, who had the dream and the tenacity to get the hall started. These days, the original Hockey Hall of Fame has a home at the Invista Centre Arena on Gardiners Road in Kingston. In this episode of the podcast, we tell the story of the hall with the help of an individual who has spent 40 years on the board of the hall. His name is Mark Potter. Mark, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's nice to be here again. Thanks for having me.
Now, there are a lot of folk in Kingston who are very passionate about the original Hockey Hall of Fame, and you happen to be one of them. Bill Fitzel was another, and for those people who may not recall, Bill was a newspaperman who was a hockey historian, who was your friend and mentor, and he contributed a lot to hockey in this town. But on this particular program, you and I are going to talk more about you and your role in the Hockey Hall of Fame and the Hall of Fame itself. But before we get into that, for those folks who may not know who you are born and raised in Kingston. And my first question is, was hockey a big sport for you growing up?
Oh, it certainly was. Most of my life actually revolved around hockey. I'm so blessed to have the childhood I had. Growing up in Portsmouth Village, it was a wonderful time. It was a really nice place to be, and a lot of old families, long settled families in Portsmouth. But the hub of Portsmouth really was the Harold Harvey Arena, which was home to the Church Athletic League. And we spent virtually our entire winters there, and in every capacity. I mean, I was a hockey player, not a very good one, but I was a hockey player. But I was a timekeeper. I was an occasional referee. I was a rink rat. And we also had the outdoor rink at Garrigan Park, which is adjacent to the Harold Harvey Arena. And we spent many, many hours on the outdoor rink as well. And in addition to that, we were always playing street hockey. So it was just kids getting together, and we had teams from different streets in Portsmouth, and we'd have little tournaments. So much of my life revolved around hockey from a very early age. And I had a passion from it right from the get-go, Dave.
Now, you and I first met when you joined the staff at CKWS Television, working as a sports anchor, and you had the distinguished honor of being the youngest anchor ever in the history of the station at age 20. And you worked with Max Jackson. Now, this podcast is listened to by folks in a lot of different areas, and Max Jackson is a name familiar to a lot of folks in Kingston, but not outside the area, I would think. So give us a little thumbnail sketch of Mr. Jackson.
He was a legend. You know, he was the first guy on television in Kingston to do sports, which would have been in the 1950s, and he was there until the early 1980s. And as a kid growing up, I mean, Max Jackson was your window to sports because, of course, back in those days, there was an afternoon newspaper. There was, of course, no internet. And if you wanted to find out who won what from the day before or the night before, it was Max Jackson. And Max was a guy that worked literally at the station 18 hours a day. He did the early morning radio sportscast. And again, if you wanted to find out who won the hockey game or the ball game the night before, you'd have to find that out from Max on the radio in the morning. He was back at noon hour to do noon radio sports. Then he did the afternoon radio and the supper time television sportscast, along with the late night sportscast. And he was also Kingston's play-by-play hockey announcer. So we did the Kingston Aces, the senior A team, and the Kingston Canadians, a major junior team when they came in the league. And he had a 30-year run in Kingston, and he was an icon. He went to every kid's banquet. He was the public address announcer at Kingston Ponies baseball games, which back in the day were something a lot of fans attended. ended. So as a kid, Dave, I remember from the time I was 5 or 6 years old, there's Max Jackson on radio, on TV, calling the hockey games. And next thing, I'm working at CKWS. I did do a couple years in radio before I got into TV. And I remember one of my first days ever being in the radio station as a part-time weekend announcer and seeing Max Jackson. And I almost wanted just to reach out and touch the guy, right? I couldn't believe. I'm like, this is Max Jackson. I'm like 3 feet away from him. Like it was something else. And then I sort of got to befriend Max a little bit as a part-time radio announcer. And I would, I'd buy him a hot chocolate and sit in his office and talk to him. And I think he took a liking to me. And then at 20 years old, actually Chris Cuthbert, who was one of the preeminent announcers in Canada, currently working with Rogers Sportsnet, but he's called NHL hockey, CFL football for years. So Chris was working with Max. Chris was doing the 11 o'clock sports. And I used to drive Chris Cuthbert to work every day because we worked the same shift I was on the radio side. And one day he told me that he was going to leave. He was going to a Montreal radio station, which was a big sports station, CJAD in Montreal. And that sort of launched his career. And he said to me, Potter, you know more about sports than I do. You're so passionate about it. He said, you should apply for my job and go into TV. I'd never done TV in my life. And you're right. I was 20 years old. If that opportunity came along today, I probably wouldn't have the guts to even try it. But they gave me a chance to try it. Al Brooks was the station manager. He basically said to me, Mark, we're going to give you 2 weeks on TV doing the 11 o'clock sports every night. And if that doesn't work, we're not going to keep you. And I said, well, if it doesn't work, Al, can I go back to my radio job? And he said, no, you're done if it doesn't work. So, I was literally hired, Dave. I was hired on a Friday, and they said, okay, you start Monday night. And I started Monday night, and I went in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I kind of shadowed Max and watched him do the 6 o'clock sports. And at 11 o'clock, it was me. And I did it for 2 weeks. And I don't think I fumbled or stumbled once in 2 weeks. And I was on my way.
That brings back some memories. Now, at some particular point around the same time, you decided to get involved with the Hockey Hall of Fame. Now, you've been on the board a long time, and you were president for a number of years, and you're still active on that board 40 years later. Let's go back to the beginning of the Hockey Hall of Fame. Let's talk about one particular guy whose name is Captain James T. Sutherland. Let's start there.
Well, they called him the father of hockey, and that's what he was known as. His era was around 1900 and beyond. Essentially, he organized and coached all the serious hockey teams in Kingston starting in the late 1890s. So basically, if you were a hockey player, you had to get past Captain Sutherland to play on one of the primary Kingston teams, which even included the Kingston Frontenacs, which some people might not know. That hockey club actually dates back to 1897. So he would hold outdoor tryouts. He would have kids playing on the lake in the Kingston Harbor, and he would pick all the teams. But beyond that, he went on to become the president of the Ontario Hockey Association, later the president of the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association. And he was just the man in Ontario as far as hockey went. But he had this burning desire that he felt that there should be a Hall of Fame that would honor the greats of the game. And he pursued this dream literally for decades, like probably for, close to probably 30 years. And then at one point, baseball decided to set up a Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, which really spurred him on after that happened. And finally, his dream came true. So in 1943, he convinced the National Hockey League and the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association that they should have a Hall of Fame, which they agreed. He also convinced them it should be in Kingston, because at that point in time, and it's still a debatable issue, but Kingston was deemed to be the birthplace of hockey. And obviously the National Hockey League and the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association bought into that, and they put the hall in Kingston. So that was, he was the founder of the Hall of Fame. And the other big thing that he did, among many, many things, was he was also the founder of the Memorial Cup, which is probably the second biggest trophy in all of hockey behind the Stanley Cup. So he was overseas. So Captain Sutherland overseas in World War One, and there was two players that went with him from Kingston who were hockey stars. Scotty Davidson had just scored the Stanley Cup winning goal for the first Toronto team to win the Stanley Cup, and George Richardson was probably the best amateur player in the world. And they both enlisted early. They both went overseas. They both died in very heroic circumstances on the battlefields of World War One. And when Captain Sutherland came home, he felt that there should be an award or a trophy in honor of those who gave their lives, who were hockey players, but it was particularly inspired by Davidson and Richardson. And he started the Memorial Cup in 1919. So that's his other big claim to fame. But he was a remarkable man. He died in the 1950s. He never got to see the Hockey Hall of Fame built in Kingston, which was unfortunate. But he was our founder, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody, even today, in the hockey world that has a stronger resume than Captain Sutherland has.
Now, part of the deal with the NHL and the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association was to put together a building of some sort to house the Hockey Hall of Fame. They each gave the whopping sum of $7,500 to build that building, or at least to kickstart a fundraising drive to build the building. So how did that go?
Well, not very well, unfortunately. And I think the amount of money that was provided was, even in the war years, because it was the Second World War at that point, was not nearly enough. The NHL actually at the time had 6 teams, and they each had pledged they would give another $5,000 each. So there was supposed to be another $30,000 coming from the NHL, which never arrived. So there's only $15,000 to work with. It's interesting because they started scouting around Kingston for a property. Where should we put this Hall of Fame? They looked at the county courthouse building down by the cricket field. They looked at Fort Henry. There was some talk where the fire hall is on Brock Street. I mean, that was a potential location. And they started a fundraising campaign, but there was 2 things happening. One was, again, it was in the middle of World War II. Fundraising was not easy. Construction costs were spiraling. And the tab just kept going up and up and up. So eventually they got to 50,000, which is a figure that had been mentioned by the NHL. And then Clarence Campbell, who was the president, said, well, no, I think it's going to be 75,000 we need. So they kept raising money. There's even a story that Captain Sutherland, who apparently was quite a yachtsman, he had apparently quite a boat. So he owned his own boat in Kingston. He even sold his boat to try to help fund this Hall of Fame. They brought some NHL teams into Kingston, primarily the Boston Bruins, to play a couple of exhibition games. But by 1958, we still hadn't raised $100,000. We still didn't have a building, and it was 15 years after we'd been awarded the Hall of Fame. In the meantime, we had inducted 42 members into the hall during the Kingston era. But in 1958, Clarence Campbell, the president, sent a telegram to Kingston. And of course, this was 3 years after Captain Sutherland had died. He was 85 years old. And most people believe, had Sutherland been alive, because Clarence Campbell was actually a personal friend of Sutherland's, if he was alive, that probably never would have happened, but it did. Mm-hmm. So he just sent a telegram to Kingston and said, "You guys are done. We're moving to Toronto." And there was a group that even persevered after Captain Sutherland died. They were committed to building a building, and we finally got it done on the fairgrounds, the Kingston Memorial Center Fairgrounds, at the corner of York and Alfred Street, and the building went up in 1965. And I think it's really a testament to the people that were there, that after losing the Hall of Fame to Toronto, they still forged on and actually got the building done. And I give huge credit to them for doing that.
Was there any particular person who was the spearhead for that particular group after Captain Sutherland died?
I would say Judge Garvin, who was a well-known Kingstonian and a well-known hockey man. He was certainly heavily involved in that. Also Stuart Crawford, who was a longtime mayor of Kingston, although he actually passed away quite suddenly at a fairly young age. He was also a big part of that as well. So that would be, 2 of the people that certainly tried to spearhead that drive. And I know it was a very proud moment when that building opened its doors in 1965.
So we have the building at the corner of York and what's the other street?
Alfred Street.
Alfred Street. So this is an outfit that had operated for a number of years with no government funding, run by volunteers, and you had accumulated all sorts of artifacts. Now, did you have to give back some of those artifacts when they moved the museum to Toronto?
Actually, no, we did not, because most of them actually were in the possession of Captain Sutherland. He actually had gotten those through the contacts that he had in the hockey world. So we never did have to turn over any artifacts to the hall in Toronto. And the building itself, which was a move I never really quite understood. So when the building was built, and basically the city of Kingston put in a bit of money. I think the final cost was $120,000 for the building, and I think the city put in 15 or 20,000. But the Hall of Fame board turned the building over to the city. So essentially it became a city-run building, and it was a two-story building. It was about 7,500 square feet. So in the early days, the Hall of Fame was only on the second floor, and the first floor was actually a banquet hall with an orchestra pit. And the city of Kingston would rent that out, and people used to have weddings there, stag parties there. I used to hear stories from people that were there. They'd have bands that played there on the weekend, and we're up on the second floor. But finally, actually, in 1978, we took over the entire building. We had another grand opening when we took over the full building. And ironically enough, Clarence Campbell actually came to the reopening in 1978.
Really?
And the story was that he had a tear in his eye, and he apparently told some people that he really had regretted the decision to pull the Hall of Fame out of Kingston, but he was pressured by many of the NHL owners, primarily Conn Smythe, who owned the Toronto Maple Leafs. And Conn Smythe was the guy that really wanted the Hall in Toronto. And I should point out, the Hall of Fame in Toronto wound up on the exhibition grounds at the CNE in 1961. They opened their doors. And the only time they ever got any attendance was during the exhibition itself. Mm-hmm. Other than that, nobody ever went there. And then it was in the 1990s when they moved downtown to Front Street in the old Bank of Montreal building in downtown Toronto. And that facility didn't really become a success on its own until the 90s, and it was on the CNE grounds in 1961.
Now, while we're in the 1990s, Roy Conacher is president of the original Hockey Hall of Fame, and he struck a deal. And tell us about the deal he struck with the International Ice Hockey Federation.
Well, Roy's a great man. He's a well-established lawyer in town, retired now for many, many years. And his father, actually, Roy Conacher Sr., was an NHL Hall of Famer. He was a star back in the 30s and 40s. And the Conacher family, one of the best-known hockey families in Canada, Charlie Conacher, Lionel Conacher, they're all Hall of Famers. But Roy got this idea that maybe we should team up with the International Ice Hockey Federation, which is the world governing body for hockey, including the Olympics and the World Championships. They didn't have a Hall of Fame. And the president at the time was Gunther Sabetsky. So basically, Roy got in touch with them. Some conversations ensued. We sent over a couple of delegations from Kingston representing the city of Kingston along with the Hall of Fame. And eventually we got a deal done that we would become the Hall of Fame for the International Ice Hockey Federation, which we felt was a pretty big deal. They gave us quite a few artifacts. So we did actually wind up with a lot of artifacts that were primarily from European teams, in particular the Soviet team and some of the other hockey powerhouses overseas. We had a 5-year deal, but partway through that deal, Gunther Sabetsky retired. And a guy by the name of René Fossel took over as the new president of the International Ice Hockey Federation. And towards the end of that 5-year deal, we got another letter, this one from René Fossel, saying that they were going to sever the relationship. Our 5-year deal was going to be one and done. And they decided to open up their own Hall of Fame, which was in Zurich, Switzerland. And then they turned around and formed a partnership with the Hall of Fame in Toronto. So we've been left at the altar twice, maybe 3 times when we talk about our relocation plans downtown. So we've had some bad luck along the way, Dave. But it was great to have that relationship. And we did get a lot of artifacts. And there was some cross promotion that the International Ice Hockey Federation was doing for us. But I don't imagine there was ever too many people that made the trek from Europe to come over to York and Alfred Street to see the Hockey Hall of Fame in Kingston.
Now, before the Ice Hockey Federation in Europe constructed their Hall of Fame in Zurich, and before the NHL constructed theirs in Toronto, was the Kingston Hall of Fame the only game in town?
It was, yeah. So and that's why we, our actual our real name is, or the registered name is, the International Hockey Hall of Fame. So that was the name the NHL gave us in the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association in 1943. And all that really meant at the time, international just meant North American, right? It just meant Canada, US. Yeah. That's all it really meant. But yeah, we're the first Hockey Hall of Fame in the world. We're the oldest sports Hall of Fame in Canada, and very, very proud of that. So we decided along the way, listen, why don't we change our name to the original Hockey Hall of Fame, because that's what we are, and our roots run very, very deep for sure. And we're the first sports museum to be formally recognized by the province of Ontario as well.
I have a side question for you.
Yes.
Do you have notes in front of you, or is all of this in memory?
Oh, it's all in memory. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just amazed at some of the people I've spoken with lately who have all of this stuff at the top of their minds. When I'm talking to them, they're throwing out dates and people's names, and I'm just impressed.
I have a vast amount of useless information, Dave, and I don't know where my car keys are, but I do know all this stuff.
Now let's move ahead to 2012. So the building at York and Alfred Street has fallen into disrepair, and the decision was made that it had to be torn down. So then you began a hunt for a new location.
Exactly. So as I said earlier, I mean, we had paid for that building essentially, and we turned it over to the city. But for years and years and years, it was neglected. It just got to the point, I mean, there was asbestos in the building. There was a roof that leaked, all kinds of things that were wrong with it. So we got a phone call one day and said, the building is being condemned, and we're going to close the building, and you need to find a new location. And that information became public. And once it got out in the media, I was approached by Hank Dornekamp. So Hank Dornekamp had bought the Smith Robinson building, the S&R building downtown, which of course is an iconic Kingston building. He had some big plans for the building, but he really felt that putting the Hockey Hall of Fame in there would make a lot of sense, would be a good attraction. We were supposed to be in the space that's now occupied by Milestones. So it's actually a pretty good chunk of that main floor. And when Hank approached me, I'm like, this is a dream come true. Like, we've always wanted to be downtown. I couldn't think of a better building. I couldn't think of a better location. I got in touch with Dave Branch, who's the commissioner of the Ontario Hockey League. Mr. Branch came to Kingston a few times because the Ontario Hockey League wanted to set up its own Hall of Fame, and they wanted to partner with us. And we basically had, I wouldn't call it even a tentative agreement, but we certainly had sort of an agreement in principle that could happen. So we approached the Queen's School of Business. We put together a business plan. We felt that in order to fund the museum in the early years, to do everything that needed to be done, to hire staff, to build new displays, we had a budget of about $1.2 million. And so we were on our way to raising $400,000 ourselves. We had a huge celebrity hockey dinner at the Ambassador Hotel. We had Don Cherry and Ron McLean and many other hockey celebrities there. It was completely sold out, over 500 people there. We raised $50,000 or $60,000 that night. We had some good momentum. John Garrettson, who was our MPP, he assured me that the province of Ontario could come up with $400,000 if we could get the city of Kingston to help out. So we took our proposal to city council. We lost a 7-6 vote, which I would say in my lifetime might have been one of the most crushing moments of my life, because I just felt it was so short-sighted. And for $400,000, the city of Kingston could have had a marquee tourist attraction downtown, and for once actually told the story of the origins of hockey in Kingston and the fact that Kingston could be the birthplace of hockey. So when all that fell apart, and I was pretty demoralized and not knowing where we're going to wind up, we got a call from the city again, and they said, look, we're going to look after your hallmark, and we're going to look after you, and we'll give you space in the Invista Centre, which is a 4-pad arena in Kingston's West End. And then we thought about it and thought, well, what's better for a hockey museum than being in a hockey rink where there's 4 different ice pads and it's busy all the time. So they gave us space there. And then I got a call from the Henderson Foundation. So Judge William Henderson, he was actually one of the early proponents about getting the Hall of Fame in Kingston. He was a member of Parliament, of course, for Kingston and the Islands. And he was a great promoter of the Hall of Fame back in the 40s and 50s. And I knew the judge. I'd met with him many times over the years, and a great guy. So his daughter called me and said, Mark, we've read about the trials and tribulations. We've read about the fact that you don't have a home and they're going to move you to the Invista Centre. She said, we'd like to make a donation to your cause. And I said, Annie, that would be wonderful, thinking she might give us $5,000 or $10,000. She said, I have a check for you for $250,000, which was the largest bequest that we've ever had. And I said to Annie, I said, well, I should meet with you, and I said, I'll go through, our history, what we're trying to do here, what our plan is for the Invista Centre. And Joe Hawkins, who was a longtime Kingston City Councillor and a great mentor of mine, and Joe had put the bug in her ear about giving us the money. And Annie said to me, well, I know you're good friends with Joe, and Joe says, I've got no worries about you and the Hall of Fame in Kingston. And I literally just showed up at her doorstep in Amhersview, and she handed me a check for $250,000 with no questions asked, which was pretty special. Although once we got the check, and we did have a big presentation at the Hall of Fame itself, but essentially what that enabled us to do is we completely rebuilt all our display cases. We created new themes, and we spent that $250,000 on a brand new refresh look with some computerized displays and graphics and that type of thing. And it really modernized the museum, but we owe a huge bit of thank you to the Henderson Foundation for that.
Now, the Hall of Fame is in the Invista Centre. Give me a sense of what's in there. Give me a couple of stories about the people who are in the Hall of Fame right now in Kingston.
Well, what we tried to do when we went to the Invista Centre, because we had about 1/5 of the space that we had in our own building at York and Alfred Street. So we really had to kind of narrowcast the themes that we were going to do. And the bulk of it is really a focus on Kingston. So the first thing we did is we had a professionally created film done, which is about a 12-minute film, which is the history of hockey in Kingston. And really from the early days, 1840s, Kingston Harbor, right up to Jana Hefford scoring Olympic gold medal winning goals and everything in between. So we had this film produced. We had Don Cherry narrate it for us. So we created a small theater. So basically in 12 minutes, you can get the entire Kingston story, Captain Sutherland, Davidson, Richardson, all our Stanley Cup winning goal scorers, everything. So we're focused on that. We have the original square hockey puck. So the very first hockey puck used in the very first game in Kingston in 1886 was a cut down lacrosse ball. It's a one-of-a-kind artifact, obviously. We've got that. We have the Freeling Diary. So Arthur Freeling was a British soldier who was stationed at Fort Henry. He wrote in his diary in 1843, we had fun this year playing hockey on the ice. That's the first time the word hockey was ever used or written. And we have a copy of that diary, which is really leads into the story about Kingston being the birthplace of the sport of hockey. So we've got that sort of thing. We've got Jana Hefford's display. And of course, Jana won 4 gold medals. There's 5 Kingston players. 5 players from Kingston have scored Stanley Cup winning goals. We have a display dedicated to that. We've got the Don Cherry collection, but most of the theme there really is on the Kingston story, Dave. And that's, the Hall of Fame in Toronto really promotes the NHL. It promotes modern day hockey. Really what our mission is to keep alive the history of the sport and Kingston's connection to hockey. And that's really the story we tell on the location at the Invista Centre.
One of the things I have found in doing these conversations with different folks, and I'll just throw out 2 names of folks that I have sat down with and had a conversation with. One is Brian Johnson, who is the fellow who was a pilot on the Wolf Island Ferry for 30 odd years and has written lots of stories about the history of Wolf Island, the history of the Great Lakes. And Chris West, too, somebody that you know, who is the chair of the board of the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes and the history involved in that particular museum. And we have these conversations amongst ourselves a lot of the time about being citizens of a particular town, knowing that there's a lot of history and a lot of places you can go to get a sense of that history, but we just never get around to going to visit Fort Henry or the Hockey Hall of Fame. And I'm curious to know, in your mind, how does someone affiliated with the Hall of Fame get the word out that this is a place you got to come and visit?
Well, it's a challenge, right? It's a big challenge for every museum. As you touched on earlier, we're 100% run by volunteers. We get absolutely no government funding. So from a budgetary point of view, we don't have a lot of money to spend on marketing. We are part of the Kingston Museum Association, which is a great organization, and it helps to promote all the museums that are in Kingston, and certainly through Kingston Tourism, there's some promotion there. I've just always really felt, Dave, that we could really promote our ourselves as a community as the birthplace of hockey. There's a small town in Windsor, Nova Scotia, and basically they're one of the cities that professes to be the birthplace of hockey, even though Bill Fitzel and many others, I mean, certainly qualified hockey historians would say that their story is very weak. But they've actually done, from a historic perspective, I mean, but they've done a very, very good job of marketing, right? So they have a small museum down there in Windsor. I've never been there. I'd like to get there someday. But they do a great job of telling the story. And I used to say, and I had conversations with multiple Kingston mayors saying we should put signs up on the 401, similar to, at one time at least, the birthplace of Sir John A., but the birthplace of hockey, right? Yeah. I had another gentleman who's a very well-known sculpturist in Canada. He does large sculptures, and he created a hockey monument that he wanted to do. So he wanted to put a giant-sized hockey monument, which was very detailed, very attractive from an art perspective. He wanted to put it along the side of the 401. And he came to me about 15 years ago and said, I think Kingston's a perfect place for this. He said, I think you're the birthplace of hockey. And if we had this beautiful sculpture alongside our monument, alongside the 401, he said, think about the Big Apple in Colborne. Just think about that for a moment and what it really is. And people know it from Windsor to Quebec City, right? And really, it's a bit of an oversized apple beside the highway. He said, if we had this gorgeous hockey monument, it would bring all kinds of attention to Kingston. So I tried to run with that idea through the municipality, through some local media, and it just went nowhere, right? But the bottom line is, and I guess part of it is obviously on our shoulders, but I think Kingston has just never really embraced the fact that we're the birthplace of hockey. And they've never really embraced our Hall of Fame either, right? Like even the fact that we went through all those troubles to raise money. And I know back in the day in the 40s and 50s, there was articles written saying, look, the people of Kingston need to get behind this because the NHL, has put the Hall of Fame in Kingston, Ontario, and we don't have a building and people have to step up. And unfortunately, that just never happened. So I guess what it tells me, Dave, is not very many people are as passionate about hockey history as I am. That's really the end game here, I think.
One of the things that the Hall of Fame did was establish a couple of different tournaments that take place every year. And the one that I have listed here first was back in 1969, the Historic Hockey Series. And so this is something that the Hall of Fame put together initially?
Absolutely. Yeah. Bill Fitzel was a big part of that. That was the Kingston Winter Carnival back in those days, now called FebFest. And it's a reenactment game. So we are the only major sport anywhere in North America or elsewhere that does a reenactment game. So basically what we do is we play hockey the way it was played in the 1880s in Kingston, using the original rules as close as we can, the original equipment, using the square hockey puck. We've done it continuously since 1969. We used to play for years and years and years right on the harbor in Confederation Basin, but it got to be that we typically didn't have the weather we needed. We didn't have proper ice out there. And then, of course, they built the outdoor rink in Market Square, so that's where we play it now. But yeah, it's Queens and RMC, which played in the original organized first game in Kingston, and also the 2nd Regiment, RCHA Petawawa, because as I touched on earlier about the Freeling Diary, soldiers migrated to Kingston from Halifax. That came from Britain, and they were the first ones to really play pond hockey or shinny hockey on the harbor. So basically the military has very strong connections to the history of hockey, and obviously this is a military town, so it's a 3-game round robin, and we're very proud of that, and we really think it tells a history lesson on ice, in our opinion, and it's something we're very proud to continue on. Outside of COVID, we're hoping we're going to be able to do it in February 2022.
You mentioned the Freeling Diary and the first mention of the word hockey that appears anywhere. I'm curious to know if you know how that word originated. Why did they use that particular word?
Yeah, I don't really know the exact history of that. In fact, our friend Bill Fitzel, he wrote a book called How Hockey Happened, and he goes through a lot of that in his book. But what I can tell you is that there were a lot of stick games played in Europe, so stick games that weren't necessarily played on ice. There were games such as hurley and bandy which were kind of like field hockey games in a way, right? And then eventually some of them did move to ice. So there was a game called hurley, and I think the hockey aspect of it somehow, got tied into hurley. But hurley and bandy were the big games. So it is an interesting question, and even in Bill's book, there's really no definitive answer to that. But I guess it's Arthur Freeling that gets credit for it.
Now, the other event that the Hall of Fame is involved with has started in 1986, and that's the Carr-Harris Cup. How does that differ from the historic hockey series?
Yeah, well, the Carr-Harris Cup is actually played between the teams today, the varsity teams at Queens and RMC. So in 1986, it was the 100th anniversary, the hockey centennial for Kingston. So we did a number of events that year. We had a hockey coin. So we had a centennial hockey coin you could buy in the banks. We had what we called a number 9 night at Legion 560 downtown. We had Rocket Richard there. We identified the top 100 people who had made a contribution to hockey in Kingston, and they were recognized. But then Bill Fitzel had the idea that, Queens and RMC, which actually is the oldest rivalry in all of hockey. It's older than Montreal-Toronto or Boston-Toronto or Montreal-Ottawa. So it is the oldest rivalry. And Bill said, we need to formalize this. We need to put up a trophy, and they need to play one game a year for the trophy and bragging rights for the city. And the original thought was to call it the Causeway Cup because of the LaSalle Causeway. But the Carr-Harris family, they had deep ties to both schools. So they both had family members who went to school at RMC or Queens, that coached at RMC or Queens. And it was a great idea by Bill. The family embraced it. And that's turned out to be quite an event. In recent years, they play it downtown at the Leon Center. They're now getting crowds in excess of 4,000 people. And you'll never see a more spirited hockey game than Queens and RMC, because it's like Canada-US. It's a lot of pride on the line. And it's probably the best game in hockey you'll see all year in Kingston. And again, hopefully it's going to be played in February of 2022. I think that's the plan.
Now, let's get back to you for half a second here. There's another Hall of Fame in town, and it's called the Kingston Sports Hall of Fame. And you were inducted into that Hall of Fame back in 2012. Now, what is the Kingston Sports Hall of Fame?
Well, it honors athletes and builders from a variety of sports. So basically people who've made their mark on the sports scene in Kingston, whether it's as an athlete or a community volunteer. I actually stopped broadcasting hockey games. I did hockey games on TV and radio for 30 years. I stopped broadcasting hockey games in 2011. I was inducted the next year into the Hall of Fame, which was my first year on the ballot. And, I was very, very thrilled with that. Certainly no greater honor. I mean, it means the world to me to be recognized in that way and recognized in perpetuity. My plaque, along with everybody else's plaque, hangs in the Leon Center downtown. So it's always kind of nice when someone says to me, hey, I saw your plaque down at the Leon Center. But I was very lucky, in my life as a volunteer, Dave, and I grew up with my parents in Portsmouth, Marilyn and Chuck Potter, who are wonderful people, but, they volunteered at the church. They volunteered at the school. My dad was one of the original people that founded the Kingston Ad and Sales Club, which was really the forerunner to the Chamber of Commerce, and he was a president there. So I grew up around volunteer work, but in my early 20s, I got to be around people like Max Jackson, who we talked about earlier, but Pete Peterson, who became a very good friend and mentor, Joe Hawkins, who I mentioned, who was a friend and mentor. And these people were community champions, community builders, did a lot of volunteer work. Tom Carty was another one who I got to know through the Kingston Ponies and through hockey. And just being around these people, it was instilled in me, and I feel very, very strongly about this, as I'm sure many guests you've had on the program do, that what's really important in life is giving back. It's not about what you get, it's about what you give. And I know that sounds hokey, but I'm so happy with my life and fulfilled that I was able to do that, and I've continued to do it. And I remember Pete Peterson saying to me, and I was probably only 21, 22 years old, and Pete said, Mark, whatever you give, you get it back tenfold. And the other thing he told me, which always stuck with me, and I still get asked to MC things around town and to do things. And Pete used to always say, if anybody ever asks you to do anything, say yes, because the day will come when they won't ask you anymore, which is so true, right? So it's funny, a lot of people in my circles don't necessarily do volunteer work, but it's just part of who I am. And the people that I mentioned earlier, the names I mentioned, Roland Billings, being another one who runs Pete Peterson's basketball league now. It's just ingrained in these people, right? And it's ingrained in me too. And I think at the end of the day, and again, I'm pretty passionate about this as well, but when you just talk about your legacy or leaving your mark in life, I think that's how you do it, right? It's promoting your community, getting involved in your community in whatever way, shape, or form that may look like. And there's many different avenues to do that. But I've always been passionate about sports, especially the history of sports, and that's the path I chose. But in the early years, I was involved with the board for the Kidney Foundation, Epilepsy Kingston, the volunteer Kingston organization. So I've done my share there. And I think when I was inducted into the Kingston Hall of Fame, I think on my plaque, they said that I had helped out or assisted 17 different sports organizations in Kingston over my time. And I've also joked, Dave, which I'm proud of this fact as well. I think that I have emceed more banquets, events, special occasions than anybody in the history of Kingston. And I continue to get asked to do it. And I think it's mainly because I do it for free. But again, it's nice to be asked.
Is it still called the Rubber Chicken Circuit?
Yeah, it still is called the Rubber Chicken Circuit. And, I still do, actually, I do a lot of kids' hockey banquets. And I always find it quite strange because, these kids are 12 or 13 years old and they have no idea who I am or what I've done, right? And they start talking about the fact that I was the longest serving president of the Hockey Hall of Fame and 30 years on hockey games on TV and radio. But it was all before they were born, right? So I just keep thinking they're looking up, who's this crazy old man who's up on the stage? But like Pete said, as long as they ask you, don't say no.
Yeah, and I think one of the cardinal rules of being a volunteer, particularly if you want to be someone who has a big impact on the organization you belong to, and if you use the people that you mentioned, like Joe Hawkins and Bill Fitzel and Roland Billings, these people have been leaders. And one of the cardinal rules is if you're going to be a leader, make sure that there's somebody behind you to take over when you decide that you want to back off a little bit and let a younger generation, take the torch and move on.
Well, for sure. That was my philosophy with the Hockey Hall of Fame. As you said earlier, I've been on the board for 40 years. I was a president for almost 20 years. But my right-hand man during most of those 20 years was Larry Paquette. And, I went to Larry before I decided to make that move, which was a big move for me personally. But, it took a lot of day-to-day activities off my plate in terms of running the museum, which I'd done for 20 years. And Larry was keen to do it, which was great. And I had replaced Roy Conacher, who we talked about earlier. Roy was there for about 10 years. But again, I'm proud of the fact that I'm now at 40 years. I'm still on the board. I'm still working on some special projects for the board. So instead of getting involved in the kind of the day-to-day stuff that you have to do to run a museum, I'm focusing a bit more on some bigger projects for the hall, including setting up a virtual online museum, going through our many, many archives that we have at Queen's University, sort of getting a handle on what's there and what we can repurpose. And I still have a passion for it. I think maybe, I don't think I'll stay on the board forever. I mean, I think sometimes because I've been there so long, maybe my presence is a bit overpowering and maybe they need to move forward in a different direction. But there's still some other things I'd like to do on a volunteer basis. I really haven't figured that out yet. As I said, I've had some experience volunteering in other outside things, but there's probably some other organization I could get involved with. But I think the big thing really is, Dave, for whatever you're doing on a volunteer basis, is you really have to have, if you don't have a passion for it, you're not going to have the dedication and you're not going to stick with it. And we've gone through some real ups and downs with the Hall of Fame in Kingston. And, I'm proud that I was there to sort of be the leadership group and help guide us through some challenging times.
Well, we certainly do appreciate the role that you've played in promoting sports, particularly hockey in the community. And we wish you every success with the Hall of Fame as you move forward. And I thank you very much for your time today. It's great.
Well, it's always a pleasure. And I'm certainly very glad to share the story of the original Hockey Hall of Fame, which we've been around for a long time and we hope to be around for a lot longer. And anytime we can get the word out, I think the history of the Hall is great. And it's nice to be able to share some of those stories with you today. So thanks for the opportunity, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Our thanks again to our guest, Mark Potter. If you'd like more information on this attraction, head over to the website, www.originalhockeyhalloffame.com. That address again, www.originalhockeyhalloffame.com. This episode was recorded in late November 2021 using Zoom.
The theme music for the podcast is Stace's Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the kingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.